Marky Mark, what's up, man?
Hey Jake, how's it going?
Going pretty good. I've been doing a lot of aquarium work, doing some stuff I've been wanting to do. Just got back from a trip to Houston for the Reef Currents event,
Yeah,
and finally visited Aquarium Design Group's gallery.
ADG.
ADG. They've been around for so long, it's easy to forget that they're around because they've been doing it for so long. They're not really
Yeah,
noisy. They're like busy doing aquascapes and building tanks for people. Oh my god, dude! When I walked into that showroom, I was in a literal trance for 30 minutes before I could focus on anything.
nice.
Oh my god! And when I started coming out of the trance, I realized that that's probably what the studio looks like for visitors when they see it for the first time. Just like, how do you even focus on anything? Everything's so bright and shiny and pretty, and I don't know. It was just so cool to be there and take inspiration from like a commercial facility that is just so 110% aesthetic and
Yeah,
functional. I mean, those tanks. Oh my god.
well, and the attention to detail, I've never been, but just obviously a lot of pictures, right? But just
Mm-hmm.
meticulous is the word that always comes to mind when I see those tanks, and such a rare thing in the marine trade, I think, or marine hobby, to have that level of meticulous detail and just,
It
yeah,
It was so refreshing to see just like a different school of aquarium thought right on the tail end of us just discussing the different types of tanks through the years and currently.
yeah.
Um, their reef tank is like 10 times overgrown. I think it's been going for like 12 years or something. It still has the original Ecozotic cannons on there,
Oh,
like
wow.
seven, no, like 10 of them, with a few Kessels mixed in, and their corals just have grown over each other again and again and again. It's just a big mess of like legacy coral growth. It was crazy. I didn't even take a picture. I'm like, oh yeah, that thing needs a reset. But yeah, the freshwater tanks, they don't look real. They don't look real in real life as you're looking at them. You're just like, how is there so much art packed into such a small volume? Absolutely flabbergasted. I'm coming back here. I'm like, oh man, I need to apply more aquascaping principles to my tanks. And there's this one tank. It was a 6 foot Red Sea tank. It looked straight out of the Splash Sea aquascaping competition from like 2001. Do you remember that one with like flower pots, green star polyps, daisies, some carnations, some long polyp leather corals, a few things mixed in there, a really muted Australian scoly, like dark brown with just a little bit of pistachio green.
Is that the
Um,
one with that sort of? That was like the first time I saw the blue-eye cardinal fish. Is that the same
and he
tank?
had blue-eyed cardinal fish and some little masked gobies, not a single large fish, not a single flashy fish. I guarantee you, Mike and Jeff Sensky have never seen that competition from Splash Sea from the early 2000s. It looked straight out of there. It was, 6
Interesting.
foot tank with maybe like 30 pounds of rock. All this open space on top. It was really impressive. I'm going to be putting together a different style video of that one, and I'm going to be taking a lot away from it.
Yeah, the other thing for me too that I think we've talked about this too is scale, right? th- they can make the tiniest little planted aquarium, freshwater planted aquarium, look huge in
Mm-hmm.
photographs because they don't the fish they choose are smaller, and then the plants they use are scale appropriate to the point that it makes the tank bigger. And that's something that I rarely see in the marine hobby. Part of it is because a lot of our fish are also functional additions for algae control and whatever.
Yep.
But
Mm-hmm.
but and it's small fish are not. I mean, gobies. You can do some cool nano fish, but it's also a little trickier. Like, whatever happened to the parvulus cardinal fish? Remember those guys? The little red dot.
They don't
on their
live
tail?
long.
Yeah.
It's just, it's a lot of work, and
Nobody ever figured that
10
out,
to
or is it?
15 bucks a piece. I mean, it's a tiny fish. It just probably doesn't have that lifespan.
Yeah.
If you did everything you could to extend its lifespan by feeding it more, keeping it at a cooler temperature, getting them while they're younger, what are you going to extend their life from 6 to 12 months?
Yeah.
Just for that one fish. But yeah, it was so cool because none of the corals were neon.
Yeah.
Everything was colorful, but not like burning your retinas, and it just flowed together super well.
Can I ask
mean,
what
yeah,
the spectrum of lighting was?
It was so they were using 3 Red Sea Reef LEDs. Oh god, I didn't look real close to see if they were 90s or 160s. I'm going to say they're 90s, but those at full intensity, they're still super pink, still kind of pastel-y. And pink compared to super daylight. It's not like this overpowering pink color like if you had actual pink tuned in.
Yeah.
But just seeing a reef tank that wasn't like fluorescent in your face, but also really made you stop and look. Here's the thing that really grabbed me about it. It's a super easy aquascape to do. You're talking about getting, fresh rocks of daisies, green stars, zoanthid, some flower pots, some alveopora, a couple, nice toadstools in the mix. You're done.
Done. Yeah.
You're done. No one's fighting for those corals at all. Those are corals like you can set up on a dime, and I think that is reflecting how they are as like freshwater aquascapers, because in our reef world, we grow out our own stuff, and it might take years, right? But they have like 1,000 maintenance accounts, and they don't have years to make their customers happy. They have to put something together. Now it's like, all right, what palette of colors do I have to work with? And it was just, man, it really jolted something in me how beautiful this aquascape was, and it's making me like kind of relook at my tanks. I'm like, oh man, I think there's a lot more aquascapology I can incorporate and not worry so much about like flawless, crazy contrasting colors and shapes. That was
Well,
cool.
also
So,
with the planted guys, and I would imagine the ADG guys take this approach. You're also looking at it like your end goal sort of determines your, like, especially in freshwater planted, like your plant choice, right? Like what you're trying to accomplish, what kind of theme or whatever. So you're like, oh, and like I've seen them draw it out, right? Like I'm gonna put this foreground plant here, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna put there. Like I don't ever see that. I don't see somebody, I see them put like a month into their dead rock aquascape, right? And they'll be in the garage gluing it together like I did, like, and they'll create their negative space aquascape. And then collectoritis shows up and they just buy whatever they can and just load it up, versus thinking, okay, over here I'm going to have a nice alveopora, and over here I'm going to isolate maybe some zoanthids, and they're not thinking out like, this is my end goal. We don't, I mean, I'm guilty too, right? I see a cool coral, but eventually it doesn't matter anymore. It's just a conglomeration of random corals, and there wasn't really an end goal. And I think if people went into it with that approach, I wonder if we'd see certain corals that people avoid kind of come back into favor, right? Because green star polyp is actually a really cool coral if you're thinking about it as a tool for aquascaping, right?
Well, there's Pachyclavularia and Briarium as far as star polyps go. You got daisy polyps, then you have pipe organs. So there's like 4 different very distinct corals that are really similar, also super cheap. No one's fighting for them. There was not one crazy fluorescent coral in there. The scalemia he had kind of a little bit off center. It was kind of 4 bombings. Like I said, I'm going to be working on that video in the next week or 2. If that thing had been fluorescent, the tank would have broke. The aquascape would have been broken. I mean, it wasn't even neon green. It was brown with a few pistachio splashes, and I'm just like, I kind of want the aquascapers to dip into the reef world, because they would just do it so differently, and they would popularize a lot of corals that are getting zero airtime right now.
So what was the term used? Come to the dark side? Last time we talked.
That's what they say, although it's a lot brighter. But yeah, no.
Yeah.
We need, that's one thing I want to see more of. We're going to talk about different reef keeping methods with giant double air quotes, because I think you'll find a very reef therapy conclusion when we wrap it all up. But speaking of crazy colored corals, I just want to give a little rant to the show that I went out to. It was really disappointing because this event was put on by a club. Not really disappointed, but one part of it just kind of just wasn't there. So, I think I complained recently about like Aquashella totally blacking out, like basically turning off the overhead lights in the saltwater section to try and make the corals more poppy. Like, first of all, if your corals are happy and healthy and you already have blue lights and you're already wearing orange glasses over your tank, there's not that much more contrast and saturation you can get. And if vendors really don't want any light coming down and spilling and just diluting any of the radioactive fluorescence, they can set up a tent. Or if you want to do a little cheaper, I saw a dude at Reef Palooza earlier this year. Man, he mounted a straight up umbrella to his lighting fixture. That venue was actually kind of bright if you didn't have like bright, strong blue lights. So he mounted an umbrella to his lights to make just a nice little shade over it. Mm-hmm. But because the room was so black at Reef Currents, I couldn't talk or see the person across the table from me. I couldn't see my friend standing next to me. It killed the community part. I thought these frag swaps and events, especially put on by a club, it was to talk to people and commune with folks and socialize, talk reef, but it's like, man, that's the part that really kills me. And I'm just going to put it out there now. You're going to get some 2-star reviews from you in the future if you black out the space around the coral vendors, because like I want to see the face of the person who's selling the coral. Like, let's have that socializing. Let's be friendly. Hey, what's your name? You're not even going to ask them their name if you can't see their face, because the blue light is so bright and all you can see is the coral. It's like it's just gone a little too far, and homies need to bring that back in for future shows. Like dim the lights. Or put it on the vendors to shade out their own tanks if they're just so committed to only the fluorescence of corals and not the inherent beauty of the coral frag, colony, or species.
I mean, I think I've harped on Windex tanks and stuff before, but I don't get the obsession with how much the coral glows in the dark. Like glows under the blue light. Like, I think it's a cool side effect.
It's one part.
Right. That was with like, back in the daylight where you had your halides 10Ks and then you had your actinics come on, like left on a little bit longer at night. You were like, oh, that's kind of neat. Like that's.
Yeah, exactly.
But now it's all about just that,
Just blued out. I mean, there's something to be said for it, but that's not all of it. And seeing this one room at Reef Currents that was completely blacked out to the point where I was just losing my vision how blue and bright these corals were, and just missed opportunities to actually discuss reefing with people who keep reef tanks. I didn't even want to ask them, like, oh, what kind of lights you keep this on? How does it grow for you? Where'd it come from? Yada, yada, yada. I just wanted to just make quick rounds and kind of get back to a normal setting. But I feel so much better just getting it out there. That's why this is reef therapy. And feel better. So I saw two extremes. On one end, I saw the totally blacked out coral vending room where you couldn't see the person, your friends standing next to you, you couldn't recognize them. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I went to Aquarium Design Group and saw a tank that really moved me.
So you're saying my next conference I'm going to go to is going to feel like a strip club? It's all blacked out with black lights.
I'm not saying it's all or nothing, yo. It's not all or nothing, like if the vendor is really adamant, put it on them.
Yeah.
Right? The venue doesn't provide the lighting. for the corals, why should it provide the shade for the lighting for the corals?
True.
Just,
Yeah.
put up your own tent. If you got a bunch of tanks, go grab yourself a freaking $3 umbrella for the dollar store to prop over your tank to shade it out from the overhead lights, and we can still have a good social experience and actually talk about reef tanks like me and Mark are about to do super hard.
Let's do it.
Did you see the coral grafting video I did?
I did. Yeah.
How fun was that?
Yeah. I like the creativity in that.
It's so funny. People are comparing it to like a coral dying and like regrowing on its own skeleton. I'm just like, well, we kind of been doing that for like a really, no, wait, since the beginning. And this is something I've planned out and thought about for a long time. And when I put it together, I'm like, wow, that turned out really good. I essentially turned one coral into two, kind of hacking the growth rate. And it's not sitting on just like some flat bases. And I'm like, oh man, that coral's super cool. So yeah, I have some more in the works, but I'm going to be crafting live to just kind of reset certain coral colonies. So today I actually fragged out a ton of red dragon. Basically, I bushwhacked the entire freaking colony, and I'm just going to put two like real nice bushy branch tips back, because Acropora carduus grows so fast. You've grown it before, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. I would have to say the. I hate to call it Japanese because I don't even know if it comes from Japan. Well, so the Koji, I'll just call it a Nephthia for now. I still don't know what it really is, but the Koji Nephthia, the green, essentially the green Kenya tree or green Capnella, and then the red dragon acros were probably in the last, let's say, 10 years, the three corals that made me go, holy crap, there are still really cool new corals that are super easy, right? Fairly easy, that are different, right? Like there's still stuff out there, for that can just become a staple. Like the red dragon is, to me, was, again, maybe other experiences are different, but it was like a green slimer. I mean, it just grew, you hacked it down. It was very easy to distribute. It was a fast grower. But it was different. It was cool. It was a different, the color, the shape.
It's the pinkest, fastest grow. I mean, I'd put it out there. It's the fastest growing acro there is.
Yeah.
Just plain and simple. Like, it'll grow okay in low light. It'll look decent in medium light. It will develop blue tips in bright light. But I'm going to go on record right now. Stop calling it the Tyree red dragon, because I don't think he's ever seen a coral in the wild. That coral was discovered by Vincent Chalias at Bali Aquarium and maricultured and then distributed all over the world. It doesn't matter if you have the exact strain, because they're still, well, I don't know if they're shipping them now because everybody just wants tenuous. But yeah, red dragon, oh my God, I made so much of it. I just called up on my friends. I'm like, I don't want all of this. Please take it off my hands. Let's trade for some stuff, or just take it now and we'll, I'll get something back later. But yeah, super fun doing those series of videos, actually getting some trimming and pruning on my flagship reef tank. That's a lot of acros, but man, the challenge with acros when you're trying to create an aquascape is they just all grow out of proportion, like way, one's going to grow super fast, another one's going to grow super slow. So it's been, oh my God, it's probably been a year in the works to finally get some good grooming done. But I don't want to do it all at once, because I don't want like a whole bunch of exposed coral tissue all at the same time. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to do it in 3, 4, 5 stages.
My reef life wasn't that exciting. Today I trapped and removed my large flame angel. My whole, I'll have a harem of flame angels. I got tired. I mean, the last thing you want to do is sit with a beer in front of your reef tank and stress out about just one fish being a total jerk. And I said, during the day, he would just beat the ever-living crap out of the female flame. And yes, maybe I should have had more to distribute the aggression like a true harem, but I tried that, and unfortunately I lost the other one during quarantine. But and then at night, he would woo her and want to mate with her, and I just couldn't stand it anymore. I was like, you got to go, man. This is an abusive relationship. I don't like seeing
any aggression in my fish tank or reef tank, even if it's natural. I want to see peace and tranquility.
Agreed. Yeah, so I finally, And he was getting a little mean towards my Regal, who I got from TSM, which was actually smaller than the Flame. So I was like, so I put him in my coral quarantine tank for now.
How did you trap them?
I got one of those acrylic boxes. It looks like an acclimation box, but it's has a trap door with a little fishing string where you just pull and it pulls
Is the
tab
door
out.
kind of at an angle?
I have that one. That was like the Aquametic one, but that one had a heavy glass plate and sunk to the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
So this one just hooks onto the tank like an acclimation box from, picture.
Yeah, I still use my Aquametic, and I use some very strong magnets to pin it wherever I want.
Yeah.
And man, it's crazy. Like, you have any problems with tangs, just feed in there. Sometimes, I mean, you're talking about a few hours. If you have well acclimated fish, a few hours they go in there, you pull the string, door drops down, you're done. The fish is, you don't even have to like net it out. You just grab the whole container and just go put that in a different tank.
That's what I do. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you always end up catching a few fish, so then I dump it in a bucket and put the ones that weren't the problem back in. But that wasn't too bad. And then I bought a new skimmer, but I'm not going to install it till I'm back from vacation. So we'll see.
Okay, I think we can talk about that when you come back for vacation. And so, I mean, I think I already have some filler or a stand-in special session of reef therapy for next week, so we won't have any interruption, and you'll get to listen to it because
that'd be cool.
That'll be fun.
Yeah, I'll be swimming on a real reef, and then I'll go back and listen to you guys talk about reef keeping.
So you going to Hawaii?
Yes, sir. Well,
island?
assuming both my kids test negative, because they've got really strict requirements for entry for anyone that's not vaccinated. And of course, my kids are too young to get vaccinated. So.
Right.
So waiting.
So
on
what
those
do you
results.
plan to do when you're in Hawaii?
So I Googled and looked up the best hotel for easy snorkeling, and that's where we're staying, so we can just do that. And then I booked a snorkel tour, a kid-friendly one. Like, there were some more cool adventurous diving I could have done, but it's a family trip. I got the little ones with me, and I'm trying to get them into the reef and snorkeling, so I'd rather do like the kid-friendly cattle boat that feeds, cinnamon buns in the morning while you're going out to the reef, and hot chocolate, and just get them stoked on it. So we're going to do a snorkeling tour. And then I've got a car rented, and I've got all these places on the island that I want to hit and snorkel.
Waikiki
And I know
Aquarium?
the coral cover is not great there, and it's very homogeneous, but I'm still excited.
I would say the coral cover is great, but there's 4 species.
That's what I mean,
right?
yeah.
Parietes, Paucilopora, Montipora capitata, with Lobactis scuteria, disc corals, fungias, actual fungus mixed
I
in.
always love seeing fungus in the wild. No, I heard they had some setbacks with bleaching and stuff, I think in 2014, 15, but I don't know. We'll see.
The reefs?
Yeah.
What about the Waikiki Aquarium?
I'm not going to be there. I'm going to be on Maui.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. But
Fortunately,
no,
I wanted to go see the Waikiki Aquarium, and I also wanted to go to
deep
the
reef
Bishop
exhibit
Museum.
with freaking Personatus angelfish
Yes.
and peppermints. I don't know what they still all have, but oh my goodness, that'd be so awesome.
That and the Bishop Museum would have been cool, but I am going to go to the Maui Ocean Center, check that out. But yeah, I'm just looking forward to it. Yeah, little
Cool. Well,
R&R.
when we're done with this, I'm going to send you a few contacts, and maybe you can connect with some movers and shakers out in Hawaii.
Yeah, maybe.
Cool. So we have a fun, important conversation to jump into. You want to introduce it?
Yeah, so reef keeping methods, which some of them are well known, some of them I'd say were maybe short-lived or kind of on the periphery. But I think they all deserve their moment of discussion or moment in the sun, And if you don't know what all of them are, that's fine too. We'll try to describe them to the best of our abilities. But they all, I don't know, it's interesting because a lot of times they're variations of each other too, right? And then, like you said at the end, in the end, they're all kind of, yeah. All right.
Oh, so let's talk about one that is virtually unknown and is not on our list.
Okay.
And we only came to learn about well after the reef aquarium hobby was thoroughly established.
You talk about leeching?
I'm talking about Li Qin
Yeah,
Eng.
Eng, yeah.
So I don't remember all the details, but this guy was Indonesian.
Yep.
I know he had access to fresh corals and seawater. I think we're talking late 60s. Does that sound right?
I want to say 70s, but yeah, I mean,
Okay, which before
yeah.
most of us. And he had his own method. I mean, if he had written the books in English or any books, oh my God, he would be the just godfather of godfathers of reef keeping. So this guy, he took live rock, natural live rock straight from the ocean, put it in a tank with fresh collected corals. I don't remember how he lit them up. Probably diffused natural lighting, I would assume.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And I know there was no real power heads available to him. And so he would use airlifts and air stones. And if I recall, he would even try to do some tricky stuff with his rocks where if a bubble kind of built up in under a rock, as it got too big, it wouldn't move the rock like a bubbler toy, but it would just kind of spout out in a little bit of a random or periodic nature. Do you remember reading anything about that?
Yeah.
So, this guy, oh my goodness, ahead of his time is not even giving him enough credit. You see some picture of his tanks from the 70s, and you're like, what? How is that even possible? It does look like, freshly harvested stuff, not crazy grown out, but early days, we were just trying to figure out how to keep this stuff alive overnight, let alone for a week or a month.
Well, you think about, because for a while their corals were considered impossible, but, these very sterile fish-only systems, had we read about him, or had people in the 80s read about him, or early 80s, and approached fish only is more like how we now term fish only with live rock, right? The success rate probably would have been a whole different ball game, right? I mean, we were throwing pennies. Not we were too young, but they were throwing pennies in tanks for like the minute copper dosing, and I don't know. It makes you wonder, like you said, if his knowledge or his publication was more distributed, translated, and available, like, would people think? Because even I think about if you were living in New York, Carolina coast, even if you just got some semi-temperate rocks out of the ocean and put them in your fish-only system, it'd be a game changer, bacteria diversity-wise and everything. I mean,
yeah. So before reef aquariums were even enough of a thing to put a label on it, you had this crazy pioneer trying to apply some of the natural balance to a saltwater aquarium with corals and invertebrates, very similar to how the freshwater old timers were doing it. They didn't have access to a lot of filtration, but they would use, try to balance out the plants and the snails and the lighting and the number of fish in the aquarium. Really let it season and mature. They didn't keep giant fish, because those guys are so dirty. But yeah, I think it was really parallel. And then everything got worse.
Yeah.
Everything was all like, all right, we don't know how to keep these clean, so let's just try to keep them as sterile as possible.
Yeah, they were.
That's not what let's see, like inline canister modules, lifeguard style with crushed coral, sometimes with undergravel filters, and probably, just instant ocean salt, or salt that was just like barely good enough to keep the fish alive, not good enough to keep them colored, let alone stop head and lateral line erosion with dead coral skeletons. And that's not what we're talking about.
Because you talk about what and I don't want to jump the gun, but we were talking dates around like the Berlin method in one of our last talks, and I'm always shocked at that being something in the late 80s, because and this goes back to not having the internet and just the global distribution of information at your fingertips. My pet shops that I walked into, there was none of that. It was dead coral skeletons, undergravel filters and wet dries, crushed coral, bleach your dead coral skeletons, put them back in the tank. It was just white, sterile tanks everywhere. That's all there was. And like I remember the lifeguard filters. I remember they were like, what were the slightly larger canister filters? The ones that were like 12 inches
The
round?
lifeguards were tall.
Tall and narrow.
You can get them in different lengths or heights for your heater, your UV, your mechanical, maybe a little biological, and you had an inline pump that you just connected everything as. The other one was, oh my goodness, I forget what they're called. I think Red Sea bought them out, but they were big, fat, squat
big
canisters.
Fatties, yeah.
Same idea, but just loud. And again, that's not super focus of what we're talking about. I love how we're talking about, I'm looking at our list. Okay. So this is not in perfect chronological order, so don't add
We're
us.
going to miss some too, I'm sure.
I'm sure we're going to
somebody.
Yeah,
bringing
I don't
that
know if
up
we're going to
yet.
miss any of the important ones, honestly. We
Well,
have a pretty good memory. But it won't be in perfect chronological order. And back then and to this day, there's a lot of elbow room between different types of tanks. So was it last session or this one before that? We talked about different types of tanks.
Mhm.
This is different types of tank methods. So you got fish aquariums, reefs, nanos, seahorse tanks, macroalgae tanks. We're not discussing these methods as applied to all of those. Really, we're just talking about keeping corals alive and growing in what we would classically call a reef aquarium.
Mhm.
Is that all right?
Yeah,
All right.
that's what I was going to actually interject with, is that from a method of keeping a reef tank really is where these were popularized.
Back then, it might have just been called an invertebrate aquarium.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we have a good one for kicking off the list of different methods of how to reef. I think it's a good one for you, Mark.
Which one do you want to start with?
Top of the list.
Top of the list. The wet dry?
Yeah.
Yeah,
The wet,
I used to think
dry
those were so
trickle
cool, by
filter.
the way, as a kid.
Dude, inherently they are cool. You're
Yeah.
making it rain on some biomedia.
Yeah.
You got this tray where you can get your pre-filter pad in there. People got a little tricky with it later with their
The
their
spinners.
spinning.
It's
Yes, the
spinning.
spinners. Oh man, those toys were so much fun.
Yeah.
Man, this is a good time to have someone like Sprung or Fenner to tell us the exact nuances of how the stuff is introduced, because I believe it was like a couple articles or a series of articles in FAMA that just set the saltwater aquarium world on fire with, was it the Dupla method?
I don't
'Cause
know.
there was
I
all
mean, I'll be
Dupla-
honest with you. I don't know how wet dries became a thing, because when I got really into it, wet dries were already a thing.
Yeah, I do believe it was a series of articles, and it was Dupla from Germany, now way better known for plant stuff, that had Dupla wet dry trickle filters. I'm not sure if those words were combined back in the day. We had wet dry, trickle. We're talking about the same thing. We're talking about making it rain on some kind of shapes, bio balls. God, I remember when I first got into it, it was just like, who could come up with the most creative form of wet-dry biological filtration? And there was BioBale. There was obviously
yeah,
bio
that was
balls.
CPR had a
BioBale.
lot of the BioBale stuff.
Yeah, creative plastic research just basically
Just shredded
strips
plastic.
strips of plastic. It wasn't just like shredded confetti, but it
Yeah.
just held itself up. Film, used up film for photography. That stuff is used up, exposed, whatever. And you can just kind of shove that into a spot. My favorite one was Army Men. Plastic Army Men. I read about it once, and I saw it like a couple times where somebody just threw a bunch of Army Men into their wet dry chamber, and I just thought that was so fun and creative and cool. But it really introduced the concept of a sump, of an underneath the aquarium filter, as a primary source of filtration activity.
There was one exception. Do you remember those tanks where the water would flow out the back, overflow the back of the tank, and there were
Yes.
trays of crushed coral it would drip through? on the back
The-
wall of the tank. It was
Was
like
that, like, are you
built
talking
into
about
the tank.
Are you talking about early all-in-ones before they were all-in-ones?
Pretty much, yeah. I think you're
Yeah,
right.
pretty much. They all-in-one wasn't like that's not what we called them back then, but yeah, there's that, and then there's the overhead.
Yeah.
The overhead
yeah.
filters. I think those were mainly an Asian phenomenon.
I was about to say,
But
I always saw those on arowana tanks.
you still do.
Yeah.
In freshwater, you still have these narrow chambers that rest over the tank. The water pumps up and then just flows down back into the tank. You can have the media wet. You can have it submerged. But for the reef aquarium hobby, the wet dry trickle filter underneath the tank really, God, that was such a huge moment in aquarium keeping in general. Just the idea of having the water flow down to a processing area and then be pumped back into the tank. And then within that processing area, you could put your auto top off with a float valve because gravity is better than your machine. And you could put your heater down there. You could put your media reactors down there, your foam fractionator down there, your denitrator down there. You could put all the things down there, and all you would have is a drain and a return on your tank. Keep everything nice and pretty.
But the only, you'll recall this even when wet dries fell out of favor and people started thinking about just other methods, the only sumps you could really get for the most part were wet dry sumps that you just rehabbed. I mean, unless you used a fish tank, right? Like unless you grabbed a fish tank and said, this will be my sump now. Off the shelf sumps were all wet dries. Like you would just pull all the crap out and basically just reconfigure it, and that was like the start of like the DIY for me. Was like my first sump was an old Miracle wet dry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Hey, fun fact, first bio balls ever made in America were here in Colorado by a Miracle.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know
They're made
Miracle
here
was
in
a Colorado company.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I don't know
Nice.
where the company was,
Yeah.
corporatized, but I just know that the bio balls were molded here somewhere, somewhere here. Yeah. So the wet dry trickle filter and their spin-offs, man, they just really kicked things off in terms of how to process, aquarium water in more thoughtful ways. But what was the problem with the wet dry trickle filter as we saw it?
Nitrate factory, right?
They
at that
worked
time.
too good. They
Yeah.
worked too well.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about, well, denitrifying bacteria are a different story, but nitrifying bacteria, in a way, their limiting resource is oxygen, right? And so saturating them with oxygen by not having them fully submerged, but just kind of soaked, right? Just it really, I guess, hypercharged the nitrification process. So every little piece of ammonia was just scavenged into nitrite and nitrate. And so, back then the enemy was nitrate, right, for saltwater. Freshwater fish were less concerned with nitrates, but, the common knowledge that was shared at fish stores was like, marine fish are more sensitive to nitrates. That was one thing. But yeah, and so you're not letting the organisms have opportunities to that resource, right? To that
to process the raw organics before
Yeah.
it turned into a form that was more difficult to export. And I mean, this is where all the nutrient export discussion originated. Man, we're
Yeah.
40 minutes in and we just now starting on wet dry. This is going to be a good chunky conversation. I'm excited, man. I'm really excited about like drilling down into all of these because I think our final conclusion is going to be a very typical reef therapy-esque finale. So there was a lots of permutations of the wet dry trickle filter, as a system, maybe not as a method. Then people start getting a little tricky with it as far as like having your water go through the protein skimmer before it hit the wet dry. I think that helped a little bit. But those skimmers back then, oh my goodness, they were just, there was just, it was like if you took a straw and just blew into an air stone. That's about how much air most of them produced.
Yeah.
But I would say, there was a assortment of techniques that kind of arose right next to that, probably in response to these higher nitrates. It's like, oh, how do we deal with these higher nitrates? And this is a more biological approach. In no particular order, we're talking about probably phytoremediation. And this was not exclusive to someone, but a few different versions sprung up. We had algae scrubbers, different takes on that with like the algae wheel that you mentioned last week.
Yeah,
after
the eco
we finished.
wheel.
What was that? The eco wheel. So this was
Yeah.
like a bio wheel, but it actually grew algae on it.
Yeah, it was actually a brilliant design because the thing about turf algae is, again, if you think about like the common waterfall algae scrubbers today, the algae that we were chasing, and that was, again, you could question whether we should be still running down that road. But Walter 80 with the algae turf scrubber really popularized the idea of growing turf algae, which are algae that grow in an intertidal area. So they're exposed to air and water. And again, plants that are fully submerged are limited by the amount of carbon dioxide that's available in the water, right? Plants that are adapted to grow in an intertidal zone are able to use the carbon dioxide that's also in the air, so they're less limited, right? They're less carbon limited. So 80 really pushed, you need to grow turf algae, which is why his turf scrubbers were dump buckets, right? So they'd fill up, and then after a certain weight was achieved, it would seesaw and dump out the algae exposed to air. The eco wheel was essentially like, if anybody's ever had a bio wheel power filter, which is really just a wet, dry nitrification, right? You're exposing the bacteria to air. The eco wheel was like a bio wheel, but it grew algae. Then there was the ebb and flow that came out, which was a seesaw, also dump bucket with two opposing dump buckets.
At the Aquatic Wildlife Company in Tennessee. I don't know if it was Nashville, but yeah,
no, it was in Cleveland, Tennessee.
Okay, Yeah, okay, sure. Thanks for that, Tennessee.
I went there. I visited
in another state. But what's interesting, so I remember Walter 80, and what was his book?
Dynamic Aquaria. And there was a lot to his method. I mean, he was against impeller pumps because the impact on myofauna.
I forgot all of that.
The Archimedes screw pump. Remember those things?
Oh my God, preserve the plankton. We don't want to blend up the copepods.
But he was also, I think, and this will bug you, but this is, I think, why we call it what we call it. He is the one that introduced the refugium. But his concept was actually a refugium, right? It was,
I love refugiums. I love the idea of actual refugium as outlined by Walter Addy, for sure. I love that idea, except for the part that every corner of your reef tank and your sump becomes a refugium, whether or not you want it to.
True. Yeah, and his refugiums were always depicted with caulerpa and stuff, but his insistence was, this is not your algae filter, right? The dump bucket is your algae, your turf scrubber is your algae filter. And I could go on and on about that method. There were a lot of weird quirks about it.
I want to hear a little bit more about it, because like I didn't have the book like you. I remember reading the articles and the references. I mean, he had a huge impact on biology and preserving plankton and using algae to clean the water. And I remember these dedicated refugia that were just basically a chamber inside the aquarium with some rubble and usually some camel or peppermint shrimp. If you don't know camel shrimp, they're also known as humpback shrimp, and we don't really keep them because they love to eat shrooms. Great animal otherwise, but you'd keep them in this enclosure by themselves, so as they spawn produced offspring that would just go out into the tank and hypothetically feed your coral. Wow. And when you put all those pieces together, the algae scrubbing, the plankton preservation, the turf scrubbing, Ooh, man, that guy made his mark, even though no one knows his name anymore.
I do. No, but his method, I mean, some notable public institutions tried to adopt his strict method, right? Like by the book, and they had their share of problems, and I think that kind of ran the whole dynamic aquaria and 80 through the not through the mud, but then people had a lot of issues with it compared to other methods, right, that we're about to get into. But it's one of those don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Like
For sure.
his flaw was his insistence on like these strict guidelines, right? Like you had to rinse your turf algae with fresh water to rinse out all the amphipods because they're eating the turfs, and that's bad because they're reintroducing those nutrients. And it's like, really? So there were some hardcore things that I think kind of killed it, but you got to give him credit, like, because I think a lot of things that are now just mainstays in the aquarium sort of originated out of that concept or out of his ideas.
He would be. Is he still alive?
I was looking it up the other day. Like, I don't think he's passed, but he's got to be up there in age. I know he was sailing a boat or something for a while, but he had
just a quick search.
That's the other thing that killed it, was he was so strict about the patent that the only people that were allowed to make his dump bucket design was Inland Aquatics. And then eventually that relationship, I think, fell out of favor too. But and maybe the ebb and flow, maybe Dana Riddle had some ability to do it. But
Well, that was kind of a workaround, but yeah, it's all right. So here's the interesting guff. His militant approach to package all of this was basically the first spawn of methodizing an aquarium technique.
Yeah.
So in a way, he created the first kind of method, and the idea of having methods for doing this stuff. But because he was also so militant of like, you have to do it this way and you have to license the patent, that it also held it back.
Well, and he
So
only let one or two people do it. So it's like, even if he just did, if CPR, who was a big acrylic manufacturer back in those days, if it's like, hey, you guys can build it, I just want a small royalty of like a couple of bucks or whatever, whatever. I think it would have popularized it a lot more, and it would have been more mainstream. And he still would have, had his nice little sailboat money or whatever he did with his money.
Yeah. No, it's funny how those two things go hand in hand. At one time, you're a super creative genius, and you put together all these very different components into a method, but then you're also super militant about not letting other people use it. So that companies like Aquatic Wildlife Company had to kind of work it around. I'm like, hey, man, you don't own algae growth. Like, let's get real. But, man, that guy would be rolling. I don't think we're not sure where he's at. He's getting up in years, but he would not be thrilled with people confounding refugia and algae turf scrubber, considering he came up with both as separate concept.
Right. And I'd love to, I mean, if anybody knows what's
How
going on.
annoyed
with
would
him,
you be?
Because I maybe we're getting some of his facts wrong, right? And I don't want to speak
I think we
ill,
got the gist.
But I mean, 21 years ago at MACNA 2000, he was talking about the fact that, if you just exclude herbivores from a section of reef, it gets overrun with algae and all the coral gets choked out. 21 years ago, he was basically telling you not to worry so much about your phosphates and nitrates and focus on herbivory, right? Like, that's...
Now is a great time to interject that his aquariums didn't have that many corals.
True.
He had a lot of lagoonal species, like not even soft corals. We're talking bubble corals, elegants, zoanthids, shrooms. But back then, the focus wasn't just like laser guided just onto corals.
Yeah.
It was also about the starfish and the shrimp and the sea cucumbers.
It was
and
a
the
microcosm.
clams.
I mean,
Yeah, that was the goal, was putting everything together. It wasn't just strictly coral growth. But yeah, now that we talk about it and say it out loud, it's like, man, that guy did some stuff.
I don't want to
He
drag
really
it
did some
out,
stuff.
but he had, I think, a 125-gallon tank, and he built up the reef right in the middle, and he had the dump bucket from the turf scrubber hit it from one end, and that was supposed to be like the reef crest. And then, of course, that wave action hits those rocks and disperses. And then on the other side of the rock pile, he just had like seagrass growing and had like a little lagoon. And
Mm-hmm.
the kid in me was like, "That's so freaking cool!" Like he's created 2 reef zones in a tank, you know. So anyway,
Yeah, in some ways overthinking it, but
Yeah.
yeah, that's the first truly saltwater based aquarium method that I mean it lives on in so many ways in the reef aquarium hobby today. But the
Mhm.
next method was not developed as a method. You know, it was a community of guys sharing notes
Mm.
in Germany, and they came up with something that would later become called the Berlin method.
Yep.
And if I describe all my tanks today, I would say everything's just modified Berlin. You know, my tanks personally. Do you want to describe the Berlin method as you remember it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably going to get it wrong, but my interpretation back in those days, or at least when it was adopted stateside, and we joked about this because you recently posted some pictures on Reef Builders that showed some of the original Berlin tanks, and it sort of contradicted some of the stuff that I had come to believe stateside. But bare bottom, that's the one that was
Mm-hmm.
sort of contested later. I was like, look, they got sand in those tanks that we see pictures of now. Um, Obviously, live rock, protein skimmer,
Lots of live rock, huge protein skimmer, few
and
fish,
few fish, and then usually kalkwasser was their
and
choice of
kalkwasser.
calcium and alkalinity maintenance. Yep. And yeah, they would have like these 4-foot Sanders airstone skimmers and stuff.
With dedicated air pumps, just pump a ton of air in there. You know, I'm sure Venturi technology was around, but it wasn't optimized for this, let alone downdrafts or needle wheels. But yeah, just that's what put protein skimmers on the map as a really critical tool for keeping saltwater aquariums of
That's
any
a good
kind.
point. Yeah, that's a really good point. Because I mean, it was pretty much that was, and that was back in those FAMA articles. That was the big debate, writing into FAMA was
Mhm.
like the wet dry diehards were freaking out, and then like, well, it's like, well,
Mhm.
where's your biological filtration? And the idea that you just needed these living stones and a protein skimmer. That was it,
Yeah.
So, but
When I
that
got into the hobby, every tank that I saw was described like that. This is a Berlin style tank. This is a Berlin style reef tank. And I mean, I could still remember seeing some tanks that were exactly that. Tons of rock, very few fish, super skinny yellow tanks because they barely ever fed it, bare bottom, and just a oversized, underperforming, very loud protein skimmer.
Well, and the guys that would write into FAMA asking about switching to the Berlin method, really all they were doing was pulling their wet dry out. That was it.
And maybe putting a lot more emphasis on the protein skimmer too.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, really, it was like how, like, I think, was it Reef Notes? No, what was it? What was the, I think he probably answered 30 freaking times somebody asking, like, well, should I pull out 1/3 of my bio balls and then wait a month and then pull out another? Like, they were all so scared to pull their bio balls out, like, abruptly. And they were like, oh, the biological, like, I'll just do, like, a little every week. And I think I saw that question like pop up like a million times. I was like, oh my God, I would go
How
nuts.
do I
having a-
convert? But once we had, the Walter Eddy method and its components, and then the Berlin method come onto the scene and the existing wet dry, then you really saw this competition and this culture
Oh yeah,
of how do
it
you
became
keep your
team
reef
sport.
tank?
Yeah, for a little bit.
Team sport, yeah, that's a great way to put it. Tribalism in the reef world. Well, how do you do it? In the early days, it's like, can we even do it? Can we keep this alive? Okay, sure. I still remember like a FAMA article from early '90s, before I actually started, where someone had like a 2-month apart photo comparison of fire coral, which is not even a coral, actually grown. And I'm like, stony coral growth? Is it possible? And look where we're at now, complaining about how people are actually growing their corals. But yeah, once we had a few different techniques, then the team sport of how do you reef became more part of the fabric of reef aquarium culture.
And to your point about just this die-hard strict adherence to a singular methodology was bad, right? Because when the great debate between the 80s algae turf scrubber and the Berlin method, that was another big heated debate back in those days. The irony was that they sort of solved each other's problems. So like the hybrid where you see today people use algae filtration in a Berlin style setup and vice versa. It's interesting to me, right? Like the big problem with ATS was terpenoids and the yellowing of the water, which protein skimming and carbon would have fixed.
Algae turf scrubber.
Algae turf scrubber, yeah.
Yeah, just explain
skimming and carbon from the Berlin style team would have addressed that, right? And in the Berlin style, they could have probably benefited from growing some algae somewhere sometimes, not always.
Yeah.
I mean, plenty of tanks don't need it, but
absolutely.
But that strict adherence or opposites, it's like they had just come together, had a few beers, and helped each other out. Like they may have come up with that hybrid solution or sooner, maybe. I don't know.
I don't know what I was going to say.
All right.
But, I was going to say that the Berlin guys, they didn't set out to build a method. It was a community of guys who shared notes for who knows how many years, just enjoying the alchemy involved in keeping these corals alive and all the animals alive and growing.
Yeah.
They weren't trying to build a method, but the wet dry and the natural aquarium folks, they were definitely a little bit campy, and that started leading us into more of these reef aquarium styles being compartmentalized. But I want to come back to your point towards the end of pulling from each. But I think, I got super excited because right when I got into hobby, I mean, it was just a few months, maybe about a year after I got into, really aquarium hobbyist, not just having fish tanks in the corner. There was a Seascope article, I believe it was written, oh God, I don't remember who wrote that one. But it was describing the Joubert Plenum, the Joubert method of having an empty volume of water underneath your, a kind of a thick sand bed. Now, what people kind of failed to remember, two things, is this was done on a very large aquarium at the Oceanographic Museum in Monaco. It had kind of a open airlift design.
But wasn't there also like a 3% water exchange also?
I'm getting there.
Okay, sorry, I jumped the shark.
But it had a slightly open airlift design, so it wasn't directly drawing a ton of water through, these airlifts to pull water through. So it was just like a very gentle, subtle, exchange of water coming through the sand bed. And what was lost in the translation or just in the team sport of it is I don't know what, it was a gradual water change on a daily or weekly basis with the Mediterranean Ocean. People forgot all about that and they just focused on this empty space. And then I still remember, I can still remember all the articles. I'm like, what's the best way to build a plenum? I built plenums for myself. I built plenums for people because by then was my early years of like working at fish stores, talking the lingo, have my method of making a plenum for other people's reef tanks. Usually a couple pieces of PVC, egg crate on top of that, then some window screening, then the right mix of medias so you don't have it going through. Oh my goodness, we worked so hard to produce that plenum, all in the hopes of, having some kind of integrated nitrate removal.
Yeah, and that was sort of the issue with the Berlin method for some, right, was it still left nitrates on the table. And then we started looking at, well, how do we solve that, right? And yeah, I built a plenum once. And I had like a 6-inch sand bed, crushed coral bed, because it required that larger grain, and
I guess I was kind of attached to it because it was an early technique introduced in the early days of my aquarium career. And I'm like, oh yeah, this is what's up, and it's what I knew. It's what I knew.
It
So
had a
that's why
coolness to it with the Monaco aquarium and Joubert.
Mhm.
There was something, and I mean the photographs of his aquariums were amazing, right? And he did have some
Those
closed
were
systems. To be
amazing
fair.
corals.
Yeah.
And even like a 3%, 5%, 10% weekly exchange is not huge. But I
Yeah.
think part of the technique was that the acid buildup in the plenum would naturally dissolve the calcium carbonate.
Yeah.
And there's so much more nuance to it that was just lost, through the years, and that's another part that people didn't really understand was the buffering capacity as the acids build up from the organics breaking down and the respiration of the microbes underneath that plenum just naturally dissolving the media to just keep everything just a little bit more balanced so you don't have to do so much. It wasn't supposed to be a silver bullet panacea for every little thing, but it worked for a long time. I'm pretty sure that was one of the best, largest reef tanks in the world for at least a decade.
Yeah. I thought it was cool. Obviously, I mean, if you can't tell by our discussion, I was a little bit more like the way you were romanticized by that. I was romanticized by 80, right, and
Yeah.
the ATS. So I didn't jump all into the Joubert method, right? But I did think I like it was kind of like a sexy new thing that I was intrigued by, and I did set up one tank briefly for a while that way, just to see, because I did think it had it when I still thought nitrate reduction in a sand bed was necessary, which I obviously don't think anymore. I thought it was a better method than a deep sand bed.
Again, it just got so oversimplified.
Yeah.
The nuances of what that was trying to achieve just got lost in the noise, and it wasn't simply about removing nitrates, but it was a very discrete thing you did to an aquarium. If you had a plenum, you had a plenum. You were using a Joubert system, and I'm very proud to actually call Dr. Jean Joubert, a friend of mine. I've had dinner with him many times, and he actually collected probably one of the most widely distributed corals on planet Earth, the Milka stylo. That's where I got my information about it, and I tracked it back to the source, and it was to him, and he told me what year he collected it. Not quite at the Red Sea, but at the mouth of the Red Sea in 1984, if I got that right. And it's just so awesome that this guy has done so much. He's worked a lot with like nanotanks in recent years. I think like 6 or 7 years ago, I shared a video of a fish bowl or something that he had done that just hadn't had a water change. But it had a good mix of invertebrates
had some
and
like
fish and
xenia
stuff.
in there and stuff, right?
Yeah, very cool little, self-contained, and it's just really nice. He doesn't work at the Oceanographic Museum anymore, but man, I really got to get over to southern France and visit him and get a behind-scenes tour and a history lesson from this guy who had such a huge impact on the reef aquarium hobby, and spawned a lot of Me Too methods.
Yeah, like the NNR, was it the natural nitrate reduction method?
I would say the deep sand bed method. It wasn't called a method, it was just called DSB. Deep sand bed. So if you're not familiar with deep sand beds, it was like bell bottoms of reef tanks.
And that's a great analogy because I am embarrassed that I was part of the deep sand bed crew back in the day. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of like being embarrassed about wearing bell bottoms, well, maybe you shouldn't be embarrassed about that, but I drank the DSB Kool-Aid, man, in the early 2000s, and had to go get my South Down sand from Home Depot, which was like cheaper than the Carib Sea stuff, and
let's back it up for a moment, because some of the DSB deep sand bed really came out of the very first sparks of like online reef aquarium community.
Yeah, that was I would say the DSB took off sort of around the era where Reef Central became probably the most popular reef forum at that time.
1999, really getting some legs in 2001, and then getting steam after that. But if you're not familiar with the DSB method, it was this harebrained idea to put 6 inches, correct me if I'm wrong, 6 inches of lytic.
Yeah. According to Carib Sea, the finer the grain, the less deep it had to be. So even with sugar-sized sand, technically you could get denitrification even with like an inch or so, but people went crazy.
The vast majority of folks were like,
6
more
inches.
is better. Yeah. And when a bag of sugar-fine oolitic aragonite cost anywhere from $35 to $40 at the local fish store, there was a company called Southdown that offered this stuff as like non-toxic, like
it was
play
like play sand for your kids' sandbox.
And oh my God, I remember all the threads on Reef Central and Reefland and Reefs.org of someone finding Southdown at their local Home Depot.
Because it wasn't
Home Depot
at
was
every
much
Home
smaller
Depot,
back then
right?
too.
Yeah.
Home Depot was much smaller than Lowe's or even Ace Hardware back then, and it was like, oh, you could get this, was it 50-pound bag for $5?
Yeah, compared to like $30 or whatever for a 40-pound bag. Yeah,
and people went nuts, and you saw so many tanks that were like 18 inches deep, and a third of that was taken up by sand.
I mean, I think so. It was Rob Toonen, who now it lives in Hawaii and does coral
no,
research.
You're skipping ahead. We got to talk about the Ron Shimek before you get to Rob Toonen.
Well, but I would argue Toonen was the one that really, like through testing and everything, said, look, you don't need a plenum to have nitrate denitrification, right? To have that anoxazone. But you're right. Shimek was the one that really pushed the finer grain sand.
Well, he pushed this romantic novel that all your waste is going to fall into the sand, and everything that grows into the sand, all your amphipods, spaghetti worms, tube worms, bristle worms, they're just going to consume it all and break it down to a point that lower down the bacteria were just going to be able to like denitrify it because it was anoxic.
And his idea was that the finer the grain of sand, the higher the diversity of organisms that would be living in it versus like a very coarse grained sand. And I think he just ran with that, right? It was all about ordering bristle worms. Yeah, we ordered bristle worms from Inland Aquatics, by the way.
The only pictures of Ron Shimmick's tank are of his sand bed.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, man. One time I saw this one tank that was set up with a DSB that had never been touched, and there was just like, it was like a prairie dog colony in miniature with all these little spaghetti worms had made these perfect little mounds. It looks really cool, but I'm not here for worms. I'm here for corals and fish and macroinvertebrates that I can actually see.
Well, I think when my honeymoon ended and I could see clearly, I actually wrote on Reef Builder something about reef keeping demagogues, right? About these people that we religiously like worship and their mythology, and we give them a subform, and then you've never seen a picture of their reef tank. And I'm like, well, why am I following this guy, right? And and other people have said the same. It's like, if you're gonna follow somebody's advice, you should probably look at their reef tank and see if you like his results, right?
Well, my biggest problem was like, if you want to plenum, I mean, later on when I kind of started shaking off the starstruckness, I was like, why are you going to have it? Why is your tank a third sand? You have a pet sand bed, literally breathing and exuding CO2, dropping your pH super hard. Why don't you just put that in part of your sump?
Yeah, just have a remote sand bed if you really want to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was an offshoot. But another small offshoot was natural nitrate reduction, NNR. That was clearly Bob Gaumond's trying to champion something and trying to create something that was already happening without him. Yeah, but yeah, so many articles in FAMA about NNR, NNR, NNR. I mean, he just kept throwing out that acronym all the time, trying to make it a thing. And by then, like, Joubert and deep sand beds were already kind of on the ropes with most folks. But man, it was so funny to see some people not read the fine print and put something together like a deep sand bed with silica sand, and you could
Yeah.
just see all the blackness underneath. You saw some people doing this. They just didn't read all the details, and instead of using aragonite, they used the silica, and it was just this black anoxic hydrogen sulfide layer down at the bottom.
Well, and that was the problem with the sugar size too, is you want it to be oxygen low, but you don't want to go full hydrogen sulfide, right? And that was
Right.
the beauty of the Joubert method, is that I think was missed. And I mean, yeah, you could argue that the hydrogen sulfide buildup, I don't know. I mean, you heard about people stirring their stand bed and killing everything, but then I've also heard the opposite, right? So it's hard
Yeah.
to say how much of a risk that was, but yeah.
Mm-mm-mm.
So then we had, which
A good next. Are you still talking about sand, or are we talking about the
No.
next one?
the next one.
Okay. All right. You introduce the next one.
So this one was interesting, but I feel like, again, this was one of those things where like we had a good idea, but it was like, well, I can't make money off of this good idea unless I
This
make you
was the
buy
probably
something.
This was the first of many merchandised reef aquarium methods.
And that was
For
where
sure.
I have nothing against. I don't know the person who started it personally. I have nothing against it, but when this got popular, I'll just preface it with this: being a Walter 80 fanboy, but I believed like it was flawed and it needs a skimmer and
Okay,
carbon and blah
what,
blah blah.
What is it?
Well, no, I'm
what
not
is
going to
it?
say it yet. There were plenty of us doing this without. All right, so the one I'm talking about is the ecosystem method, right? Which is essentially a Caulerpa scrubber, right? And there were plenty of us on the Reef Central forums and elsewhere already really digging into this, right? And we were
Mm-hmm.
digging into solving the nitrate riddle in a Berlin system by growing Caulerpa, because we couldn't go buy a dump bucket because of the stupid patent crap. So we looked at,
Not to mention all the
macroalgae.
splashing and bubbles and.
Well, yeah, and I ordered my very first Caulerpa from the, what was it? The Aquatic Wildlife Center in Cleveland, Tennessee. They sent me Caulerpa taxifolia all the way to Boulder, Colorado. But yeah, then the ecosystem method came out, which was essentially just a Caulerpa macroalgae refugium, algae, whatever. But you had to use their substrate. And you had to refresh
Mhm.
their substrate on an annual basis, right? So now you've created the subscription model. You've come up with a way to generate revenue for something. And I
There was
don't
ecosystem
doubt.
mud. There
Yeah.
was ecosystem additive. Oh my god, I would kill if anybody has a bottle of ecosystem additive. Like, please at me right now. I need it. And then there was the ecosystem like garlic to add to the food. Go ahead.
And I don't doubt the efficacy of the substrate, because I think people were finding terrestrial leaves in it and stuff, so they determined it was like a terrestrial substrate, which is probably rich in iron and a lot of other
Probably
minerals.
just some iron. Probably
Yeah.
mostly iron.
So it was great, for maybe some trace elements and iron, and the Caulerpa loved it, and it was good for growing micro myofauna. Nothing wrong with it. Like, it worked. So like, I don't want to dog it. Like, it actually worked. And if you want to use their substrate in your macroalgae tank, like, you're not going to have a bad time. But it was expensive. Holy crap, was that stuff expensive for dirt.
For the day. It
For the
didn't
day.
count-
Well, it's still
it didn't-
expensive. Go Google it, man. It's like, it's crazy.
It's actually astounding that you can still get it, and that it's been like 20 years and it still has some legs, and some people are still kind of swearing by it. And it's important to mention that this was another method that was really framed as a method.
Right.
You had the miracle mud. You put that in a remote sand bed kind of area. You had a 24/7 macroalgae growth on top of it.
That
of
was,
Caulerpa,
I would
but
say that was a
not-
distinguisher, was because they were
24/7?
pushing. Yeah, that was not something that other people were doing, and that method was some where it was like to prevent the caulerpa from going sexual, just light it 24/7. Like that
Yeah,
was
because if it's lit 24/7, it will balance out some of your CO2, some of your pH. I guess we didn't even talk about RDP yet. The reverse daylight photosynthesis, which had been the norm before this, of having your lights on your macroalgae section, your turf scrubber, opposite of your reef tank. But yeah, it was just kind of a modified algae scrubber, but the mineral substrate was kind of the key. And he had all these advertisements showing how he would take a
Emperor Angel with
Emperor
HLLE,
Angel with a ton of head and lateral line erosion. Put it in a reef tank using this method, and 6 months to a year later, it was all gone. It was actually quite impressive. I still picture those images today.
I mean, I liked it because it was like the closest thing to like a algae focused method around at the time. So, I dug it. But, it was a method that evolved because up front, he highly insisted on weekly water changes, I believe, and also a bare bottom. And then over time...
I don't remember the bare bottom part.
Yeah. If I recall, it was bare bottom and very frequent water changes, no protein skimmer, but then he changed his tune on protein skimming later and started to advocate a protein skimmer as well.
Mm-hmm. But they had their own filters, their own hang-on-the-back filters.
Sumps, yeah.
Creative Plastic Research had their own line, so he opened it up to other folks to make this thing so he could sell the mud. It was called Miracle Mud. Oh, did we even mention the Miracle Mud? This is the first time we mentioned it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it was called Miracle Mud. The substrate was called Miracle Mud. You can still get it today. And it's Mike Paletta introduced this in an article of Seascope.
Seascope, yeah. But then
Seascope
who was
again.
it? Tom, one of the main Seascope guys ran an experiment. He ran one with Miracle Mud and one with just oolitic sand in the caulerpa. I'll just call it a refugium, even though that drives you crazy. And he saw really no noticeable difference, and that was also published in Seascope. But yeah, I mean, the thing that bothered me was if you use they have a little calculator that gives you guidance on how much Miracle Mud you should use based on your tank volume within your sump. Frakes, thank you.
Yeah.
But if you look at that calculator and then you add up, it's insane how much like the cost is. And that was the same when we were all doing deep sand beds, right? Like how much money we were spending on sand.
Yeah, but you couldn't get a Southdown equivalent or a Miracle Mud equivalent at your Home Depot. There wasn't a hack to like skip the line or whatever. Yeah, it got exponentially expensive when you did a large tank, especially if you're trying to use a certain amount of Miracle Mud relative to the volume of your tank. But one thing that's astounding about it is it still has its proponents. Yeah. It's kind of, like you said, shifted with the times. Initially, it was no protein skimmer, and then later on, they realized that people just love their protein skimmers, and so they started making these Miracle Mud sumps with protein skimmers built in. And I think there was a follow-up by Mike Paletta like 15 years later. That might have been on Reef Builders, where he talked about like, hey, I've been away from it for a while. I'm dabbling in it again, and you know what? There's still something you can't put your finger on, but I think it's just a unique mix of trace element release by the Miracle Mud.
I agree, and I will say with some of these like snake oil, whatever you could call it, like people after they've tried it, they come back to reality. But I know several people who have used it for years and believe in it still. So there's something to those trace elements or that iron or whatever it is, right? There's something to it. So that I don't want to dog it too hard because, I kept tabs on several reef keepers that just still stick by it, and they'll even like, a couple of them like have gone on to different methodologies, but they still put some Miracle Mud in their sump, not like with a caulerpa bed, but just as almost like a slow release trace element additive or something.
Yes.
So there's something to whatever he's digging up out there in California for sure.
I mean, this is not a plug, but I don't think any tank would be harmed by putting one of their little trays of Miracle Mud in the sump in a corner where you don't see it, and just let it do its slow release thing.
Although it makes a mess of your tank when you first put it in. 'Cause
Yeah,
I
yeah.
tried it. I tried it in a small 50-gallon tank because I was just like, why are these people so gun-ho about it, right? And yeah, you definitely got to be prepared for the tea-colored water for a day or two. But
Mm, mm. All right, so I don't know that much about the next one, but you do, so you take it away.
yeah, we can keep it short. So obviously when the DSB crowd went crazy, eventually you're going to have what's the word I'm looking for? A push, not a pushback, but like a counter,
Correction.
a correction. And that was like the best I could call it is Starboard Reef, right? And the only reason that is because one of the main proponents of it, instead of going fully bare bottom, he would use Starboard, which is it's almost like a plastic that they use on boats and stuff to build decking. He would put that on the bottom of his tank and then put his stuff on there. So that doesn't sound very revolutionary, right? But the other things that, again, sort of like what you said about the Zeovit method that get missed over time in history was that were, in my opinion, somewhat interesting was the flow is insane. He was a big pusher of, I think that was the first time I started to take note of those, what do you call them? You use them too, where it takes flow from the side and amplifies
Eductor.
it. Yeah, like he was a big proponent of adductors, but also very wet skimming, right? So it's almost like a partial water change type level
A
skimming.
concentrated water change.
Yep. And like a super oversized UV to the point that the UV has like an oxidizing quality similar to ozone, right? Because a UV will produce oxidants as well. So he was basically using a UV almost like an ozone unit. So those things were interesting, but really the real interesting thing was that the band of followers that joined in, in my opinion, and everyone remembers history differently, that was the start of the end of the deep sand bed, where people were like, screw this noise, I'm shoveling all this sand out of my tank, I'm going bare bottom, only this time they're putting a big thing of cookie cutter board or whatever under their
What was
rocks.
the point of the Starboard anyway?
I think people were just worried about rocks coming crashing down and cracking the glass, maybe. It was more attractive to them to see like a white Starboard bottom.
And it wouldn't slide around.
Yeah.
And it would dent in a little bit, and the plastic would kind of hold it.
Yeah. And when I did bare bottom last in my 225, I put a cookie cutter or a cutting board that like locally I had cut to fit my tank on the bottom, and obviously inspired by those guys, right? But part of it was just I knew I was going to stack really high rocks, and I just kind of liked the way that looked, so I did it. But I didn't go oversized UV wet skimming and all that crazy stuff. But I give it some credit because those guys and their fervent nature, like really.
That was the online tribalism team sport.
Yeah, there was like,
for sure.
40-page debates, and people would get banned, but it was really the end of the deep sand bed, in my opinion.
Nice. Thank God.
Yeah.
Thank God.
Yeah.
We ready for the next one?
Yeah, I'll let you do that one.
So the next biggest technique was undoubtedly Zeovit.
Yeah.
This is probably mid 2000s to the later 2000s, and at first we were still using very white light. No, still LEDs are not a thing. Actually maybe early 2000s, and the whole idea there was to have almost bleachy corals, have incredibly low nutrients, and the corals were somehow feeding from bacteria instead of their zooxanthellae, so they basically had almost no brown color to them at all, and they looked really pastel. This is kind of came around similar timing as T5 lamps, where you could just blanket the tank with light and kind of fine-tune the color and bring out those pastel colors. It was still very daylight, and these corals they just looked unreal, but they also didn't look fleshy.
Yeah.
They looked really skinny.
It's
very skinny tissue on the skeleton, incredible pastel colors, and
but they
God, I
look
swear there was.
it's sickly to me, right? Like almost like a bleached reef right before
Hmm.
all the color is lost. Like if you've seen a one that bleached and they still have their pigments, you know. Um, and I'm not saying that's what all Zeovit was about, but I just remember seeing some of those Euro tanks and being like, oh, that looks weird.
But just like the black box of Miracle Mud, where you don't know what it was doing, the founder of Zeovit was notoriously secretive about what
Thomas
was
Pohl.
actually going on. Another Tom,
Yeah.
and one of the main. It was really like a Berlin style method, but you use this Zeovit reactor that used zeolites with water flowing through it, so like a media reactor with zeolites, and you were supposed to agitate them once a day to like kick up the mulm off of it. I don't know how much of that
Yeah.
was actually feeding the corals versus just dislodging the particles for your protein skimmer to export.
Well,
And then,
it was bacterial mulm, right? It was sort of like it was a method that circled around somewhat you could call carbon dosing, but using the whole we're going to grow bacteria and then we're going to skim them out, and that's how we export our phosphates and nitrogenous
but
compounds.
the bacterial particles were all supposed to act as a food
Yes.
for the corals, but they had such tiny polyps. Like I never saw a shaggy pastel-y looking coral. But then you added like this whole giant line of trace elements
Oh man, they had so many additives.
daily by drops, and it came in these fancy blue bottles. And you think Miracle Mud was expensive? Oh my goodness, man! Zeovit just like took that whole idea to a very high new level.
And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but zeolites are not really effective at removing ammonia in salt water, right? It's a freshwater thing. So really, it was just a medium for bacteria to grow and grow that bacterial mulm, and then you shook it, you had a little handle, and you go up and down with it, and that would disrupt all that mulm, and then either, like you said, feed your corals or you skim it out, and that was sort of the root of it all.
I'll tell you what, though, those pictures that came out of Europe before it was widespread in America, they made you rethink what your reef tank was supposed to look like. There's colors on everything, especially like the shallow water water humulus, just looking like crazy colorful, like it should in really shallow light. But it was missing a little bit of depth, like that flesh on the corals that we come to love and expect nowadays, was absolutely gone there. And it was just a never-ending parade of Zeo back and Zeo start, and Zeo add another word to it, and you put your drops in there and pulls coral vitalizer, and just all these little things that just they didn't explain it. They went
No.
out of their way to not explain it, and you were just supposed to trust the method and spend hundreds of dollars a month to keep your reef tank looking like a skinny supermodel coral.
I'm no authority on it because I never tinkered with it and I never did much. I remember the Zeovit forum, but my takeaway, and I'll tell you why I think it was just carbon dosing with some other elements, like maybe some not toxic, but some metals to stress
you're right.
corals.
Some slightly toxic elements with just like the very smallest traces of actual copper.
Yeah.
To just slightly stress the coral into making it look like that way.
But if, like, the key to carbon dosing, right, is you need somewhere. Well, you don't, but like the fact that you're carrying and taking care of this thing full of zeolite, so you have a place for the bacteria to go crazy and grow, and then you're adding drops of stuff, which to me is like, okay, one of those probably smelled like vinegar or something. And then the other thing that really became popular with Zeovit was going, like, the skimmer thing went nuts, right? That's when everybody went premium on skimmers. There were posts about Nog, N-O-G-G, which was like the memeified thing of like just nasty skimmate in your skimmate cup. So it was like share your Nog, and everybody was sharing pictures of their skimmers cups and all the nastiness inside. But that was all
thread.
That all came out of Zeovit, and that's when like ATB skimmers, Bubble King skimmers, H&S, Deltec, they all just had this resurgence where everybody was like, why, yes, I'm going to spend $1,000 on my skimmer. Because, so you think about like a super powerful skimmer, bacteria, substrate, and you dosing droppers or something. To me, that just sounds like like carbon dosing and then exporting the bacteria with a good, powerful skimmer. I could be
Well,
wrong. I mean, I don't know.
No, I think you're right because we didn't do it on purpose, but naturally people started to pick apart different elements of the Zeovit system. It was called the Zeovit system, and it's kind of the follow-up to that was the ultra-low nutrient system,
Yeah.
where your nitrates are zero, your phosphates are zero, and people are achieving that through different ways. There was a lot of copycat products. Like, how do you copy something that you don't even understand fully, first of all? But that gave rise to more carbon dosing, right? Like, actually, the old-timers, they used carbon dosing. They just didn't call it that, right? Like potato reactors. They talked about the introduction of different sugar sources for denitrification. God, what's that company in Florida that had their Reef, something Reef, Ultra Reef, Nature Reef,
yeah.
the Nature Reef system. But that one was different because it was like this weird partial water change where water was moved into a reactor, it was processed, and then it was exchanged with your tank, and it was put back into the tank the same time that water came back into that reaction chamber. But it gave rise to, a better understanding of carbon dosing, vodka dosing, vinegar dosing, VSV, vodka, sugar, vinegar, biopellets, and I mean, it made its mark. And I'll tell you what, man, I've seen a lot of tanks that still run zeolite, but not have Zeovit style results. There's still people who use zeolite reactors, but I don't know if they know what's actually going on or what is expected of it.
Do you remember Mark Weiss had this apple cider liquid concoction that he sold?
Are you talking about Coral Vital?
Was it Coral Vital? I mean,
Yeah,
it
the
was
old
carbon
Coral
dosing,
Vital.
right? It was like you open it up and you're like, this is apple cider vinegar. Like,
Once again, if someone has a bottle of old school Coral Vital, I am desperately wanting to add that to my antique aquarium product
and that was like
collection.
I mean, I don't know when it started, but I remember discovering that in like 21 years ago, man. Like, that's crazy.
Oh no! When I started the reef aquarium hobby, you had to have Coral Vital, and you had to have biocalcium,
okay.
chocolate marine biocalcium. That was the two things. I don't know if Coral Vital was just the carbon dosing because it made your corals open up more. Like you saw
True,
that
yeah.
in certain corals, so it probably had more to it. I didn't see the effect in my protein skimmer. Not that I knew to look for differences in my protein skimmer, but yeah, that was a good start. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about the ULNS. There's still a lot of tales, some camps of it where people think that that's what they're aiming for. But I'm not sure. I haven't seen any current reef tanks exhibiting those early, pastel-y coral colors like we used to see. People still dose Zeovit. They still use their zeolite and their zeolite reactors and on and on and on. But you don't see those same results. So why are they using those? I don't know. I don't have a good answer for you.
I'm sticking to it being carbon dosing, fancy skimmers, media for bacteria to grow on, and drop little drops of this every day in your tank. To me, that sounds like carbon
there
dosing.
was a fun aspect to it because when your corals are doing well and you want to do something for them, when you had this little ritual to do, like your coffee, right? You can press a button on the Keurig, but if anyone is a drip coffee guy, I got my Chemex, I got my well-ground coffee. I'm not a grinder, but the ritual of it every day made you feel like you were doing something good for your reef tank every single day.
Yeah, I hear that. Yeah, I can definitely relate.
But once Zeovit happened, people rushed to put their names on a method, on a technique, and there's just like this never-ending parade that continues to today of folks trying to put their name on a system, right? You had Steve Tyree's multi-zonal, what did he call it? Sponge.
The cryptic
this and that.
zone sponge thing, yeah.
Maybe within the last 10 years, we had the micro scrubbing nano bubbles, which was basically just skimming out your tank.
Yeah.
It was just getting the funk out of your tank, and
Well, like
you
your
know, if you had
corals would shed some slimy stuff, and that would go into your overflow box and skimmed out. But then I was like, is that good or bad? Like, does anybody
is that good or
determine?
bad? I do that on some of my tanks twice a year,
Okay.
right? Where I just put an air stone in there and just get, it's, you can put, I think it was Julian articles who first turned me on to like storm mode, taking your MaxiJet power head and just blowing off the rocks and just getting all that funk out of there. And I feel like using bubbles to make everything rise to the surface where it can be processed by the filter is probably a little bit more effective in combination with very strong water flow. But I always thought it was funny. It was like micro scrubbing nano bubbles trademark. It wasn't even trademark. It was just TM, right? So it wasn't even like registered. But I'm like, how is it micro or is it nano?
I gotta come up with one of these, man. That's like how I'll win my retirement money, Like,
yeah, we'll come up with a reef therapy.
the therapy method.
MJRT reefing philosophy. There we
But
go.
it's got to be a subscription model. We got to sell them something they have to buy every month in a little mysterious
There's
bottle.
got to be a consumable. But speaking of the subscription model, that's an awesome segue into our next category. And one of our last categories of reef aquarium methods, and this is the Triton method. And it's not even a method, it's just like pieces of all these previous methods we've talked about with very fancy, somewhat questionable water testing. The subscription model was the water testing part, is the water testing part, right? We're still talking the last 6-7 years where this really hit the scene, worldwide. But what is the method? ICP testing, so the precise chemistry if the values are correct. A algae scrubber, they call it a refugium. Anything else?
No water changes.
No water changes, which makes no sense to me at all whatsoever, because if you're dosing stuff to your tank, potassium, carbonate and bicarbonate and calcium chloride, you have this buildup of sodium chloride, which is out of balance with everything else.
Well, and I stand corrected. They typically no water changes, but if you have to dilute something, they do advocate water changes, right? So if something's like super high, like your potassium's through the roof because you overdose it, they would advocate you do water changes to bring it down.
Don't get me wrong. There's absolutely a scenario where your tank is like 500 gallons, 1,000 gallons, and something's out of whack, but you don't necessarily know how. The classical response is to do a large water change because, let's just press the reset button and everything's cool. But when you start getting to public aquarium spaces where your tank is 5,000, 10, 20, 100,000 gallons, it's just not practical to exchange a significant portion of the volume in order to make corrections.
Agreed.
So, when it comes to Triton method for public aquariums, that makes a lot of sense. But chasing all these other numbers with results that don't seem super accurate from week to week or month to month, or two samples sent in at the same time for a 50-gallon tank, like what are you doing, man? Why are you doing all this work? Triton tests or comparable ICP analyzed water sample that you have to send in generally cost between $30 to $50 depending on who you're sending it to. That's a lot more expensive than one bag of salt and 1 hour to mix it up and change out some water on your tank.
Yeah, so this is one where, again, because I agree with you I don't want to have to spend that kind of money, right? Like, it's a $50 test, and then you debate the frequency of sending that in. But that said, like, let's just take the money subscription model out of the equation. At least it's not snake oil in the sense that, and when I say that, I mean, I do think like maybe we don't need to pay attention to all the elements so closely, and have them all in like perfect ranges all the time. But by that, I mean, again, I know a lot of reefers that have amazing reef tanks that subscribe to this method, So again, going back to us following like Ron Shimmick and just seeing pictures of a sand bed, similar to the ecosystem aquarium, like I can't like dog it too hard because the results are like people have beautiful tanks that are very strictly adherent to this methodology. Um, but like I don't look at those tanks and think they're like 30% better than maybe the way you set up a reef tank or I set up a reef tank, right? And that's I think why these things are always attractive to us is that we're always hunting for that betterness, right? I think that's why Zeovit took off because once we started seeing what was it, Alexander Gers, something like some of these Euro guys,
Yes.
and you saw their tanks with these weird looking pastel
Acro, just SPS.
You were like,
Poslopores and bird's nests just saturated pink all throughout.
yeah,
You were just
you start
dumbfounded.
chasing that, right? And you're like, oh, it's the method, and my method sucks, right? But I mean, at the end of the day, like, I think the ecosystem tanks and even this Triton method. Like, I've seen some. Like, I follow their Facebook group and I see some really nice tanks, but like I don't see something
here's
of
the
like,
thing, though.
oh, see, I'm more on top of my potassium and molybdenum and see how these corals look. Like, I don't see it yet, and that's my only concern.
For sure. There's an element of the meticulousness
Yeah.
of subscribing to a particular method, whether it was Miracle Mud or Zeovit or Triton, that makes you a better reef keeper, right? It's like
Right.
parenting. Because reading a parenting book doesn't make you a better parent. But being the kind of person that will read a parenting book, that's what makes you a better
Right.
parent. You know what I mean? So it's
Well,
not
and like what you said about Zeovit, right? Like, it made you be a little more engaged with your tank too, right? Like, you're more in tune with it, and that's gonna indirectly always deliver better results, right? So,
Mhm.
but you're right.
Yeah.
Like, somebody who cares enough to try to be a better parent, for example, right? Like,
and pay attention to the smaller details of
Yeah.
your tank, of your lighting, of your filtration. If you care enough to, drill down into putting in the Zeovit drops every day or sending your Triton for, your test for ICP testing once a month, that's what makes you a better reef keeper, not the fact that you're actually using Zeovit or that you're using Triton.
and again, I don't want to speak about stuff I don't like, oh, you know what you're talking about, because I have not done a full commitment to a Triton method, and maybe if I did it for 6 months, I'd have a different opinion. But again,
My only issue is Triton method tries to project this image of, not philosophy, not religion, but then their primary components, their calcium, alkaline, magnesium, are A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3. I don't know which one it is right now. It doesn't say on the bottle what it is. I'm not even asking for concentration or a full breakdown of the elements in there. But if we're really trying to get away from this dogma and trying to get away from these techniques and the methods, tell me what's in the freaking bottle. Like, I don't need to know the exact concentration because I know you don't want, copycats to rip you off your product. That's one thing. But don't turn around and give me primary colors and tell me it's scientific.
yeah,
That's
I
not
mean-
fair. That's not sincere. It's not sincere. And same thing with the water tests, right? Okay, yeah, all right, we're double checking my calcium, alkalinity, magnesium, potassium, some of the major elements, but then all these other trace elements, you don't really tell me what they do.
I
You don't tell me if this one is super harmful or if I should bring that up or bring that
Yeah.
one down. You just you offer users the entire periodic table of trace elements down to rubidium and vanadium. What does it do? I'm not here to grow sea squirts. I know sea squirts love them some vanadium, but tell me what it does. Show me the research. Once again, I think it's the ICP tool, testing is an incredible tool. The bigger your tank is and the less practical it becomes,
right,
to
because it
actually change
allows
some
you
water.
to preserve, because natural seawater levels of all of these elements is a good goal, right? Like, if you're not going to do water changes, who knows what some of these elements do, but it's probably not great. You probably just want to avoid going out of whack with them, right? So it's like,
Once again, though, the ICP test results, I'm calling out Triton on this one. They don't tell you what NSW, what these natural seawater levels are. They give you green, yellow, red. Green, it's good. Yellow, it's out. Red, it's too much.
But isn't
They don't
that
tell you if it's
based
too high or
off?
too low.
So it's not based off natural seawater numbers?
I don't know. I don't know. It's kind of somewhat. It's again.
To
It's
your
that
point,
black
if I was
box
like
syndrome.
a public aquarium, like just to have a monthly test that says your water resembles natural seawater levels and everything, I'd be like, okay, cool. You know, like
No. There's a. It feels like a deliberate veil of mysticism put on it under the pretense of being scientific. And I'm just going to go ahead and lump DSR, Dutch synthetic reefing, and moonshiners. It's chemistry. Don't call it a
See,
method when it's just basic
yeah.
chemistry. You want to get away from the dogma and the religion, and that's actually part of your motto. Don't do that. Don't do me like that.
I'll tell you where
Tell me what's in the
have
bottles.
benefited from
Tell me where my
ICP,
levels
though.
should be.
I think ICP is in itself is a gift to the hobby because one, data. I love data, right? And the more data, like 10 years from now, as we aggregate more and more and more data, we're going to start to have some insight into some of those questions. But the other thing too is when you have something mysteriously out of whack with your tank and you're trying to just reduce possibilities of what it would be, right? Like the deduction is the word I'm looking for. An ICP test is great, right? I mean, like how many times have we seen somebody that's like, oh shit, my copper's through the roof. Oh wow, my pump was rusting out.
I was the first to drink that Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
I signed up for ICP at Triton's previous retail location with Isan Dashti. I am Triton user 1000. You want to trip him up, send him some tests labeled number 1000. I was user number 1000. And there's just been some instances where like, all right, you won't get a false negative for copper.
Yeah, so tell me about the copper.
So I've sent my results to a variety of different ICP test service providers.
Yeah.
And ICP OES, it's really important to distinguish that, and had 0 come out for copper. And I was having some tank troubles. Like I said, if you send an ICP test result and you get a copper reading, it's probably accurate. But if it tells you it's 0, it just doesn't necessarily mean it's accurate. And on a whim one time after I sent off all my ICP tests, and when something was just funky and off with a handful of different groups of corals, I just popped it into the HANA copper checker, and boom, there it was. I'm not saying that the HANA copper checker was like the be-all, end-all, but it won't give you a false positive. And once I made corrective action to show for the copper that the ICP tests did not report, my corals all got better.
Yeah.
Right? And so I don't like the black box aspect. I don't like them saying it's science or in its chemistry and then seemingly deliberately keeping a veil up to keep folks from really figuring out what's going on.
I got you. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's
not a method, it's chemistry.
Yeah.
You don't own chemistry, right? You can't just bring in this super awesome tool to the reef aquarium world and then just, keep it a little bit mystical so people don't understand it. That's not really fair. That's not really honest. But it is very lucrative.
So you'd like to see, like, if we're going to do chemistry and we're going to talk about elements, let's really be sciencey about it, and which carries more transparency.
Dude,
around
the machine, I mean, I don't know what they cost now, but at the time when they first hit the market, they were like $250,000.
Yeah.
If you're making this investment into scientific tools, don't find these nebulous ways to keep us in the dark and just say, oh, add more of element number 1 or less of element number 3B.
So,
come on, man.
And this is a good segue or a good way to go wrap up and get into what I think you want to talk about.
Before we get into that, it's a good time to mention that our Reef Therapy podcast is sponsored by ICP Analysis. It provides an ICP service, but everything I've said has no bearing on our sponsors. I want to throw it out there as a disclaimer, but I think he's really going to disrupt the space with the ICP MS version, the mass spec version. That's going to really change the game, because they're actually that machine. It's a different machine made by the same company that measures the actual mass, not the optical emission spectrum of the element, which has a lot of noise associated with it. So measuring the mass of the elements that's produced by the plasma is a lot more accurate, down into sub parts per trillion, which means you can take those parts per billion readings a lot more with a lot more faith than you can take those parts per million readings to the bank. I believe. I hope.
So on the subject of ICP and I guess isolating the technology itself and the tool it as a tool, and not looking at the whole methodology that could be built up around it. Again, another article I wrote for you on Reef Builders was my 225 gallon tank, which ran on a calcium reactor. That's pertinent in terms of element additions, and I fed it just freaking pellet food all the time because I
with no chloride or sodium imbalances.
Yeah, So yeah, I don't have my 2-part, sodium chloride buildup, but so calcium reactor, pellet food. I didn't really do any other additives or droppers or anything else for like more than a year. I think it was like 18 months. Somebody can pull up the article one day and fact check me on that. So I'd never done a water change, right, in that whole time. And I just was curious. So I sent in an ICP test because surely some things would be out of whack, right? Some elemental buildup, some elemental depletion. And what blew my mind was everything was mostly fine. My iodine was slightly elevated, and I think it was tin or zinc. One of those two was slightly elevated. But I see that in a lot of people's ICP tests, and that's just, I think, part of living in America. Yeah. But that was it. It was like, I passed the ICP exam, and I was like, but I didn't do anything, right? I just ran a calcium reactor and fed New Life Spectrum pellets. And I mean, I wrote about it, so like, I'm not going to rehash it all, but it was interesting to me that I didn't follow the method. I just did no water changes because I was a lazy piece of crap for over a year. And everything looked great. And then it made me kind of wonder, well, why am I doing water changes?
You weren't lazy. Story. You weren't even hands off.
Yeah.
You were an observational reefer.
Yeah, everything continued to look good.
Absolutely. If you're doing something, I mean, when you have 10 years of experience, I know you have more, but back then, you have 10, 15 years of reef aquarium experience. You keep looking at the corals day in, day out, and, week after week, month after month. Everything looks great. It's growing. You don't necessarily want to grow it at breakneck speed in supernatural style aquariums. Why would you? Why would you change something?
Yeah,
it's doing
I'm
awesome.
Not advocating doing that. It just was an interesting thought experiment because I had intended to do a water change because I felt bad, right? I was like, maybe I should. Maybe there's some elemental imbalance. And then, but then I was like, our nature is like, well, yeah, but what's imbalanced, right? Like, you got to do water changes because you don't want to have an imbalance or a buildup or a depletion. It's like, okay, well, let's actually test for that and see if that's actually true.
Even if your alkalinity drifted over a couple years to, let's say, 4.5, and your calcium drifted to 600 over a period of 2 years, if your corals are acclimated to it and they're looking good, it's a slow
change, right? Like
it's the slowest change.
Yeah.
Why? If your tank is looking good and you're doing things day in, day out, just enjoy it, And I would come around to kind of summarize our discussion of all these methods and saying, hey, man, there's a lot of offshoots. Prodibio was introducing specific bacterial strains that has a lot of merit. When you're introducing the food for those bacteria at the same time, different bacterial additives, biopellets. I mean, there's just lots of branches to this main trunk that we highlighted now. And I would say that all my tanks now are more Berlin than they've ever been.
Yeah.
Maybe less rock, more corals, still bare bottom, still protein skimming. ICP and the Triton definitely turned me on to paying even more attention to certain trace elements because we weren't shooting blindly in the dark and just dosing a couple things and looking for reactions. I worry more about overshooting different trace elements than undershooting, that's for sure. But yeah, I would say all my aquariums are, typically Berlin method, the way I was first, introduced to mini reef keeping, with just better bells and whistles. Dosing pumps, automatic calcium reactors, programmable LED lights, and all that jazz. But I mean, I guess at the end of the day, if you find a technique, with name or otherwise, that works for you and it's resulting in good success for you, man, just run with it. Enjoy it. Don't question it just because we're trying to like chip away and criticize every aspect of all these commercialized techniques. But definitely the movement of having these different people put together all these different processes has enabled us to just have much better longer term success with a wider range of reef aquarium animals.
Yeah, I mean, you hit it on the head. If doing the Triton method, if doing the Zeovit method gives you, you feel like it works for you and it gives you that engagement with your tank, keep doing it. But I don't know. I mean, I chased these methods for years when I was still thinking there was something on the horizon, right? And in the end, I mean, I'm not as simplified as you are. Like the one differentiator between you and me is I like to grow algae in my sump, and I do like a substrate, right? But I've course corrected, right? Like I've got
I had that big barrel of Ketomorpha for the longest time. I was using not for nitrate or nutrient reduction, but more for two things. One, to absorb CO2, and then for phytoremediation, because if things got a little high, they would be accumulated in the tissue of the Ketomorpha as I'm throwing it away. But then I found out that my nitrate was 0.00 when Hannah introduced the low-range nitrate checker. I was like, okay, that's enough of that. That's the only reason I got rid of it. I was just like, oh, I have to add nitrate now? Okay, I don't need an algae scrubber of any kind.
Yeah, I still run one. I run crushed coral on the sand bottom, which is sacrilegious, but I think it looks better. You can have more flow with it, and your tangs will graze it like it's just live rock. So you actually have a cleaner sand bed.
My favorite substrate is Reborn.
Yeah. And your
Coral
tangs
bones.
will eat it, will graze algae off of it like it's live rock.
I found 2 old bags of 2 little fishies.
The old school
Reborn.
stuff.
Yes, the old stuff. It'd been in a bag, kind of wet for long enough that there was like a little algae growing inside of it. I paid like dumb price for it because I had to have it, even though like I don't plan to use it right now, but one day I would like to build a reef tank again where I have that coral bones rubble bottom where every little tip of coral can just fall into it and just grow out of it. It was really, really fun. But yeah, I would just advise all the viewers and listeners not to get hung up on any one technique, on any dogma or methodology. Cherry pick the components that work for you. If you want to have, Berlin style aquarium and put a tray of miracle mud in a corner of your sump and, dose some Zeovit while sending off some stuff to get ICP tested, have at it. Just have fun. This is supposed to be fun.
There's been some notable experts that put out there that the failure of many aquarists is that they hybridize methods and they should stick to the true method of something, and I call total BS on that. I think it's totally great to cherry pick and choose things that you like from different methods and just kind of come up with your own thing as well. Well, it's not even your own thing because we're all just variations of each other, when it comes to this hobby, but
the moment you put a name on your reef keeping technique is the moment you're picking out a camp. And if you pick out a camp, you won't learn from the Zeovit guys, you won't learn from the Miracle Mud guys, you won't learn from the Triton guys. You're just going to isolate yourself. So, just don't go that route at all, and just keep yourself agnostic, just like politics, and just enjoy your tank. And it's about the corals, not necessarily how you get there.
Yeah, and I just... There's no subscription necessary to have a good reef tank, right? You don't have to buy someone's additives. You don't have to buy someone's mud. There's no subscription necessary to have a successful reef tank. Now, you may have fun with those subscription methods, but I just hate people throwing money away if they don't have to. It's just...
Absolutely.
So, anyway.
Well, this is one of our longest sessions of reef therapy, and how suitable is it before you go out of town? I want to thank everybody who's supported the reef therapy podcast, especially ICP analysis. I want to know more about my trace elements. I really do, but every time I see one little thing off on my ICP results, I go immediately to Google Scholar, type in the name of the element, and then like to type in like coral growth or acropora or reef, and there's just no real tangible information for me to sink my teeth into. And so, I mean, these are just tools, and we're really at the bleeding edge. And you don't put your name on actual chemistry. Just don't do it. Just don't do it. But it does make me wonder, if there's any methods left in the future.
Oh, dude,
right?
I asked that question 15 years ago when Zeovit started to show up. I was like, what's next, right? We'll be 60 years old one day. I know you just had a birthday, so happy birthday. Welcome to my my decade that I'm with the 40s, but we'll be 60 one day, and like we'll probably have to revisit this conversation because there'll be like I don't know. I don't even know what to call it.
I did see another content creator saying, hey, it would be really nice if there was actually like a wireframe skeleton recipe of reef keeping that you could branch off from. So I've been thinking about that for maybe about a year, of just how to put together something into just a stripped down, no marketing, no jargon, no black box method of reef keeping, which would not, I mean, you could put a name to it so people can kind of subscribe or whatever, but it would just be good biology, good ecology, good chemistry.
Ooh. So you could start with, you really just start foundational with like a lead chin setup, and then say, okay, let's say you want to improve flow because that's good for corals, and then you can start to talk about different types of flow, and then you could say, hey, you know what? Adding a skimmer is not a bad is a good addition to that method, right? And you could almost build from there, but all of it is sort of take it or leave it, right? But
absolutely,
that'd be a cool thing to do.
I'm kind of on that process right now with the Reefology series that we've kicked off on Reef Builders channel. So if you're watching this on Reef Therapy or listening to this on your favorite podcatcher, make sure to like and comment and rate us if you enjoy this content. But I'm trying to do that with Reefology. It's just like strip things down to the bare essentials. I'm not trying to create a technique, but just trying to get things down to the fundamentals. And that way, once you have a good background, you'll be able to evaluate what everybody else is doing.
By the way, just real quick, you remember your discussion about Chaeto and the two different types of Chaeto?
Yes.
So I got some Chaeto
it's pronounced keto, by the way.
Sorry, ketomorpha.
Do you say chaetodon? Do you say chaetodon?
Actually, I did for butterfly fish. Yeah. But anyway, I struggled for a long time growing keto, which is why I went back to Clerpa, because it was the clumpy, ratty, nasty, like baseball keto. And so I gave up on it, but then the tank was doing well, and I was like, I kind of want to diversify the algae in my Clerpa or macroalgae scrubber. So I ordered some, and I totally forgot I threw it in there. And a week later, I went in, and it's that light green, long, stringy spaghetti stuff. And I was like, I got the good one. It just made me think of you when I saw it.
One more thing, man. I'm going to call out Pax Bellum on this because they really push the macroalgae reactor. How are you pushing macroalgae reactors and telling people to dose iron and manganese and these things that algae use up, but then you don't even drill down into different types of Chetomorpha, different species. There's like 70 species of Chetomorpha. Like, you should be the one.
Yeah.
You should be the one pushing the envelope. If you really believe in macroalgae, scrubbing as a form of nutrient export, you should know more than anyone else about different types of Chetomorpha. I shouldn't have to stumble upon this like 8 or 9 years after you introduce your macroalgae reactor. Some people have incredible experiences. Other people have terrible experiences, and maybe it just boils down to the exact species of macroalgae you're using.
I don't get those those type of reactors. It just seems like, why not just stick a light in a sump compartment?
Basket.
It seems like more work, man. Just more plumbing.
Once again, like auto top offs, like ICP testing on huge tanks. There are certain setups where it's just not practical to do that, and you really want to concentrate that nutrient export into some kind of algae scrubber. And in some very limited cases, it makes a lot of sense, but that doesn't mean it applies across the board.
Agreed.
You have any final thoughts on reef aquarium methods and methodologies? Man, I think we've covered this topic more than anyone has in a really long time.
No, I mean, we went on long enough, but I'd love to hear people's take on the different methods, their levels of success with it in the comments. If we missed any that you thought had some significance, in the history of reef keeping, I'd love to hear about that. And I don't know. I just want to say, like, maybe we come off skeptical about some methodologies, but like I said, for a lot of these, they work for people, right? Like that's why they persist in the hobby.
Just because it's the first method that you were successful at doesn't mean it's the method, the only method you'll ever be successful at.
Right.
Whatever. Let's enjoy our corals. All right. We can step back from the tribalism. More than any other topic we've ever covered, I'd love to have extended conversations with people face to face on how they reef. But we'll make do with the comments on the Reef Therapy YouTube channel. So if you're listening to this on podcast form or your favorite podcatcher, check out the Reef Therapy YouTube channel where we can really engage with you guys, and we'll periodically pick up some of those questions to include into our sessions of Reef Therapy. So, Mark, have a great time in Hawaii, and thank you so much for joining me on the 22nd session of Reef Therapy.
Sounds good, man.
All right. Talk to you soon, buddy.
Talk to you soon.
Bye.